Hi, welcome to my channel. This story follows a young girl who encounters a massive giant, standing tens of meters tall. The giant takes her to its homeland, where she discovers man-eating giants, and together they fight back to protect humanity. The movie begins on a late night in a London orphanage. The orphanage matron goes to lock the door, but gets distracted when she finds a magazine near the mail pile. She forgets to lock the door, leaving it unlatched. Meanwhile, a little girl named Sophie is hiding under a blanket by the stairs. She waits for the matron to return to her room before getting up to lock the door herself. Sophie moves to the clock and adjusts the time to 3 a.m., explaining that this is the witching hour when only she is awake. The matron thinks it's midnight, while the other girls assume it's either 1 or 2 a.m. Sophie begins sorting through the mail at the matron's desk when she hears a noise outside. Curious, she checks the window and sees a few drunken men causing a disturbance in the quiet streets. Sophie takes charge, scolding them and threatening to call the police if they don't leave, which they do. Afterward, she shuts the windows and heads back to her room, unaware of the strange shadow passing by outside. Once in her room, where the other children are sleeping, Sophie hides under her blanket, puts on her glasses, and continues reading her book by flashlight. Suddenly, she hears the matron approaching, so she quickly switches off the light. After the matron leaves, Sophie resumes her reading, but is startled by another noise from outside. Though she knows it's unwise to get out of bed and peek outside at night, she does anyway. This time, it's just the neighborhood cats knocking over a trash can. But while Sophie watches, she sees a giant hand pick up the trash can lid, and to her shock, she locks eyes with a terrifying giant. Sophie rushes back into the room to hide, reminding herself again about not looking outside. Just as she's about to calm down, the giant's hand reaches through the window, grabbing her, her blanket, and her book. As Sophie is whisked through London by the giant, her blanket forms into a makeshift bag, allowing her to peek out and observe the clever ways the giant avoids detection by humans. He uses tricks like blending into walls, covering streetlights, hiding as cargo in the back of a truck, and posing as a tree. After escaping the city, the giant leaps into the countryside and eventually passes through a thick layer of clouds, leading them to giant country. He arrives at a cave, which appears to be his home. The giant hangs Sophie, still wrapped in her blanket, from a tree and begins preparing his dinner by chopping a strange vegetable called a snozzcumber. Sophie takes the opportunity to escape. She wriggles out of the blanket, climbs down to a window, and tries to open it despite her small size. After putting in some effort, she succeeds, but accidentally kicks a thimble off the table. She manages to catch it in time, avoiding the giant's attention. As she moves toward another direction, she bumps into some sewing tools, causing them to fall and alerting the giant. He turns and calmly tells her she can't leave without wings, then pushes the window shut, causing Sophie to fall onto the pan he's holding. The giant continues cooking his meal as Sophie asks where she is. He informs her that they are in giant country, though Sophie refuses to believe such a place exists. Suddenly, noises from outside startle Sophie. The sounds are coming from the other giants, Flesh Lump Eater, Bone Cruncher, Child Chewer, and others with equally terrifying names. Sophie, scared, begs the giant not to eat her. He laughs and reassures her that he doesn't eat humans. Sophie protests, pointing out that he had taken her against her will, which the giant doesn't deny. The giant asks about her parents, but Sophie reveals that she's from an orphanage and that her parents are no longer in the picture. She admits she hated the orphanage, explaining that the matron was neglectful and overly strict. The giant sympathizes, handing her back her glasses. Curious, Sophie asks if the other giants are as nice as he is. The giant, while eating his strange stew, explains that the other giants are not like him. They eat humans. Sophie is confused and wonders why the giant abducted her in the first place. The giant, speaking in his quirky broken language, tells her that if he hadn't taken her, she would have told others about him, and eventually, people would capture him and put him in a zoo. Sophie promises the giant that she won't tell anyone about him, but he doesn't trust her. Instead, he tells her that they will live in giant country for the rest of their lives. As Sophie talks about escaping, he tosses a blanket over her and places her in a crow's nest-like bed, warning her about the man-eating giants outside if she tries to run. Annoyed, Sophie corrects his grammar mistakes, making him sad. She quickly apologizes and notices a glowing object in a container. Curious, she asks what it is, and the giant tells her they are dreams. Sophie mentions that she never dreams because of her insomnia. The giant surprises her by picking up her book and reading it aloud, which shocks Sophie as she didn't expect him to be able to read. As he reads, Sophie drifts off to sleep. Once she's asleep, the giant goes to a room filled with jars containing trapped dreams and starts tinkering with them. Meanwhile, Sophie wakes up to the sound of the giant snoring and tries to sneak out of the cave. She's nearly free when a sleeping giant stops her and tries to eat her. She calls for help from her giant friend, but he closes the door, leaving her to be swallowed by the other giant. Just as things seem hopeless, Sophie wakes up, realizing it was just a dream. She quickly deduces that the giant must have made her dream it, so she tells him he didn't need to make it so terrifying. The giant warns her again about the dangers of being caught by the other giants. As they talk, he grabs a drink called Frobscottle, which fizzes in the opposite direction of normal bubbles. Sophie points out that bubbles usually rise, but the giant explains that with Frobscottle, the bubbles go down, which avoids burping. Sophie jokes that it would result in worse gas, but the giant insists it symbolizes happiness. He drinks it and releases an explosive fart. Suddenly, another giant named Flesh Lump Eater barges in, demanding attention for a splinter. As Sophie hides behind the Frobscottle, Flesh Lump Eater sniffs the air suspiciously and asks if her giant friend has gotten a new pet. Sophie's giant friend distracts him while Sophie hides inside a snozcumber on the table. Flesh Lump Eater sniffs around, but gets distracted by the vegetable. As he tries to take a bite, Sophie's legs stick out of the snozcumber. Her giant friend quickly intervenes, saying he prefers humans over vegetables. Flesh Lump Eater, frustrated, throws the snozcumber to the ground and attempts to stomp on it, but is distracted again. He eventually leaves, taking the Frobscottle with him. Once Flesh Lump Eater is gone, Sophie's giant friend picks up the snozcumber and places it back on the table, allowing her to crawl out. He lifts her in his hand, and they head to a secret room where he keeps dreams. After helping Sophie freshen up, he offers her various outfits to choose from. Sophie selects a red jacket, which she reveals was made from the scraps the giant gave her. Though he seems saddened at first, when Sophie asks what's wrong, he brushes it off. The giant gently carries her to a special tree hollow he made for her and tells her that he catches dreams. Sophie asks to join him, but the giant refuses, reminding her once again of the danger posed by the other giants. Sophie insists that staying with him forever might be just as dangerous, but he remains firm in his refusal. After much persuasion, the giant finally agrees to take Sophie with him. As they leave the cave, he warns her they must sneak past the sleeping giants without being seen. However, they are soon caught by Flesh Lump Eater, and Sophie falls off, quickly hiding in a nearby car while dropping her blanket. The other giants turn the giant into a football and begin tossing him around. Soon, they decide to play another game, with one giant grabbing a car and another taking two vehicles, including the one Sophie is hiding in. As they head in opposite directions, the giant with Sophie's car uses the vehicles as roller skates, while Sophie's giant friend is placed atop another car, sent hurtling toward the incoming skater. Realizing a crash is imminent, Sophie swerves her vehicle, narrowly avoiding disaster. The giants continue their game until it starts raining, and they retreat, terrified of water. This gives Sophie's friend the chance to rescue her. As they leave, one of the giants notices Sophie's blanket stuck to his leg. After sniffing it, the giants realize there's a human in giant country. Meanwhile, Sophie and the giant walk through thick clouds and emerge in dream country, where night has already fallen. The giant explains that he can hear what the stars, plants, and animals say to each other due to his enormous ears. He also shares that he used to be called the Big Friendly Giant, BFG, and asks Sophie what he should call her. Afterward, they jump into a lake, but when they surface, neither of them is wet. They now arrive in the part of dream country where the BFG catches dreams. He struggles with a particularly stubborn dream, and Sophie helps him catch it. After handing the dream over to her, she places it into a jar, and the dream draws her face on the jar's surface. Excited, the BFG encourages Sophie to catch more dreams. She hesitates but soon encounters a red dream, which the BFG quickly identifies as a nightmare. When Sophie asks what the nightmare says, the BFG solemnly responds, "Look at what you've done, there will be no forgiveness." Sophie panics when the BFG vanishes, but he soon reappears, lifting her out of the lake. On their way out of dream country, Sophie decides to call him BFG. They return to London, where the BFG sneaks into homes to distribute dreams. He asks Sophie whether to give a family a nightmare or a happy dream, and Sophie opts for happiness. As they share pleasant dreams, the BFG reveals that he is as old as the earth itself, and that giants don't have parents. He also tells her that he can hear the hearts of children, including hers. As they watch a young boy sleep, the BFG tells Sophie that his dream involves being friends with the President of the United States, which makes Sophie smile. After leaving London, Sophie and the BFG spot the other giants heading toward the city, as they've been abducting and eating humans. Suddenly, Sophie remembers her blanket and realizes she left it in giant country, which worries the BFG. The scene then shifts to Sophie waking up in front of the orphanage, realizing she had fallen asleep. She asks the BFG why he gave her a dream, but when he doesn't respond, she screams in panic. The BFG eventually emerges and reminds her that the other giants know she was in giant country because she left her blanket behind. He warns her that it's no longer safe for her to stay with him, but Sophie disagrees. The BFG then tells her about a boy who once wore the same jacket Sophie is wearing. He explains that the boy saw him working, and like Sophie, he was taken to giant country. The BFG tells Sophie that the other giants found the boy and ate him, and he blames himself for it. Sophie tries to comfort him, saying she's not afraid, but he doesn't listen and walks away. Back in her room, Sophie remembers that the BFG can hear even the softest of sounds, so she goes out onto the balcony and whispers, feeling his presence. In a bold move, she jumps off the balcony, and the BFG catches her just in time, saving her. They return to giant country, while Fleshlumpeder watches them enter the BFG's home. Sophie tells the BFG that they need to come up with a plan, but they soon hear Fleshlumpeder approaching. He enters, carrying a large umbrella to shield himself from the rain, and Sophie hides. Fleshlumpeder, along with the other giants, shows the BFG Sophie's blanket and makes the others sniff it to track her down. The giants begin destroying the lab in their search for Sophie. The BFG tries to reason with them, reminding them that giants were once peaceful, but Fleshlumpeder dismisses this, saying those days are long gone. As the giants search the lab, Sophie sneaks into a room inside a tree, which once belonged to the boy who had stayed with the BFG. Fleshlumpeder searches the room, but Sophie manages to hide. The BFG, becoming increasingly frustrated, finally musters his courage. He grabs a hot metal rod and charges at the giants. Although Fleshlumpeder wrests the rod from him, the BFG fights back by using a bucket of water to chase the giants out of the lab, calling Fleshlumpeder a disgrace to all giants. While in the boys' room, Sophie spots a picture of the Queen and gets an idea. Meanwhile, the BFG surveys the wrecked lab, and Sophie leaves the room, placing the boy's jacket on the bed. She talks to the BFG, who laments how poorly he speaks, but Sophie assures him that he speaks beautifully, which lifts his spirits. Sophie then tells the BFG she has a plan. They should go to the Queen for help. Together, they gather undamaged dreams and begin crafting one specifically for the Queen. The BFG pulls out a nightmare and mixes it with other dreams, including those Sophie suggests. He even adds parts of himself and Sophie into the dream. Once finished, he places the dream in a jar labeled for the Queen. Sophie explains her plan, describing how she will appear on the Queen's windowsill, and the BFG will introduce himself as her humble servant. Though the BFG is hesitant at first, they soon camouflage themselves as statues in Buckingham Palace. Sneaking past a guard, they make their way through the palace, with the BFG using his special hearing to find where the Queen is sleeping. They reach her room, and the BFG opens the window, using his trumpet to blow the dream into the Queen's room. The Queen wakes up in a panic from the nightmare. Her maid, Mary, enters, and the Queen shares her terrifying dream about giants abducting and eating children. Just then, Sophie's voice interjects, reminding the Queen of one of the giants' names from her dream. Mary reads the newspaper and realizes that children have indeed been going missing. Though the Queen is skeptical about giants, she quickly orders Mary to draw the curtains. Mary screams as she opens them, revealing Sophie on the windowsill. The Queen, astonished, admits she dreamed about Sophie being there, and Sophie introduces the BFG, calling him her best friend, who is hiding in the garden. Mr. Tibbs orders the guards to be on high alert as the Queen, recalling her nightmare, realizes that Sophie and the BFG need her help. Sophie makes the Queen promise not to harm the BFG and calls out for him, but he hesitates to come forward, causing others to doubt Sophie's story. As they urge her to come down from the windowsill, she refuses and screams, urging the BFG to be brave. Finally, the BFG steps out from behind the trees, and the guards quickly surround him. Sophie reminds the Queen of her promise, and the Queen calls for Mr. Tibbs, who nervously instructs the guards to stand down. The BFG approaches the Queen's window and, with a trembling voice, introduces himself as her humble servant, saying he's here to help. The Queen suggests changing out of her dressing gown, and while she contacts several people, Mary helps Sophie freshen up and dresses her. Together, they head to the dining hall, where a butler guides the BFG inside. Seated on a chair balanced atop a piano, the BFG joins them for a meal. The butlers, using ladders to reach the top of the giant table, provide the BFG with a shovel and pitchfork as his utensils. After tasting the food, the BFG exclaims he'll never eat snozcumbers again. When the butlers serve coffee, the BFG spits it out in disgust and instead offers a bottle of Frobscottle as a gift. Mr. Tibbs informs the Queen that the generals have been briefed, and they soon enter the room. The Queen tells them they have only one chance to enter Giant Country. They present a map to the BFG, but he explains that Giant Country isn't on it. He offers them Frobscottle to drink. And as bagpipes play, everyone experiences a round of explosive farts. The Queen, standing up, declares that it's time to head to Giant Country. The BFG sprints out of London, followed by several helicopters. As they pass through a cluster of clouds, the helicopter's radars malfunction. Safely making it through, the helicopters wait while the BFG and Sophie return to his house. Sophie asks if the BFG has a plan, and he reveals the nightmare she had caught earlier. He plans to use it on the other giants, explaining that once it works, they will wake up consumed with guilt for all they've done. While sitting outside watching the sleeping giants, Sophie sees her dream in a jar labeled with Heart's Desire. She asks about her future, and the BFG tells her that her life will be filled with much success and a little despair, but she will always be remembered for her good deeds. He then explains that she will wake up, but not in Giant Country, because she still has more dreams to catch. Sophie asks if he'll still be able to hear her, and he reassures her with a reminder of his giant ears. Holding his pinky, she tells him it's time. The BFG realizes he left his trumpet in the palace, so Sophie takes the nightmare and runs to the sleeping giants. As she tries to open the jar, Fleshlumpeter wakes up. Sophie breaks the jar, releasing the nightmares into the giants, causing them to panic as they wake. Fleshlumpeter resists the nightmare and tries to attack Sophie, but the BFG intervenes. Fleshlumpeter grabs the BFG, but the army arrives just in time. The giants are captured while Sophie dodges their attacks, and the BFG manages to save her as Fleshlumpeter is taken away. Sophie narrates how the giants are banished to a distant island, where they are dropped into the water just before reaching the shore. They are left with only snozcumbers and seeds to eat, and Sophie remarks that they'll have to get used to it. In the end, Sophie is adopted by Mary. One morning, she wakes up and shares a dream in which she saw the BFG leaping away. She describes his beautiful garden and how he now cooks better stew in his home. Whenever she feels lonely, she talks to him, knowing that he's always listening. She then says good morning to him, and in his house far away, the BFG hears her and smiles. The end.